Good morning, Hearing Officer Lilly.
Good morning, Ms. Diaz. All right, it looks like everybody who's tried to sign on has now signed on, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, my name is Alan Lilly. I'm the presiding hearing officer of the State Water Resources Control Board's Administrative Hearings Office. Today is March 21st, 2022. That's approximately 9 o'clock, and this is the hearing on the prosecution team's draft cease and desist order against BlueTriton Brands, Inc., which I will refer to as BlueTriton. And this is the beginning of the rebuttal phase of the hearing. It's been a while since we've assembled before, I'm going to ask for parties to make their appearances. And for each party, when I call on you, if one person, either the attorney or for unrepresented parties, the representative can state his or her name and then state who else is appearing for that party, that would be helpful. So we'll start with the prosecution team, Mr. Petrozelli.
Kenneth Petrozelli, appearing for the prosecution team.
And who is with you today for other attorneys, witnesses, and the rest of your team?
Mr. John Prager is assisting me. Tomas Eggers and Natalie Stork will be appearing as witnesses.
All right. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Petrozelli. For BlueTriton Brands, Mr. Donlin.
Good morning, Mr. Lilly. Robert Donlin, Ellison Schneider appearing for BlueTriton Brands. With me today, I'm looking around the screens here. I see Rita McGuire, our co-counsel, Chris Sanders, Shonda Grady, and it looks like Mr. Lawrence has joined us today.
All right. And I assume Mr. Nichols also is joining you since he is your witness today.
Yep, there he is. He just doesn't have his camera on right now.
I see his tile down there. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So for Story of the Stuff Project, who is appearing today?
Good morning, Rachel Doty on behalf of Story of Stuff, and I believe Michael O'Heaney will be joining us later.
All right. Good morning. Center for Biological Diversity.
Lisa Belenke on behalf of Biological Diversity, Center for Biological Diversity. Good morning.
Good morning. California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Good morning. Nancy Murray, appearing for California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I do want to say that the Department of Fish and Wildlife will not be participating in the rebuttal or surrebuttal stages of this. We do want to remain a party and be on the service list and reserve the right to file a closing brief.
And that certainly is fine. And you can either listen through Zoom or through the YouTube as you want, but we certainly will maintain the California Department of Fish and Wildlife representatives on the service list, and you certainly are authorized to file a closing brief. So thank you. All right, San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District.
Good morning, Mr. Lilly. Meredith Nickel with Downey Brand on behalf of San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District, here with my colleague Sam Bivens.
All right, and then our individuals who are not represented by attorneys, Ms. Fry.
Good morning, Amanda Fry, resident of California and citizen of the United States.
Good morning, Mr. Lowe. You have to go off mute. There you go.
Good morning, Steve Lowe.
Good morning, Mr. Bielecki.
Good morning, this is Hugh Bielecki with the Save Our Forests Association.
All right, and I believe that covers everybody who has appeared today. Have I missed anybody?
Larry Silver, Sierra Club.
Oh, excuse me, Mr. Silver. I see your tile down there. Good morning. Sorry I missed you before. All right, anybody else who I've missed? Before we get into the parties' rebuttal, testimony, and exhibits, there are several preliminary matters I would like to cover. I'll start with several pending motions. First of all, the prosecution team filed a motion on February 11, 2022, a motion for judgment. And then I did receive a response from BlueTriton to that motion on March 10. I've read both of those papers and the accompanying papers. So I do have a couple of most of the positions are very clear, and you certainly don't need to repeat them today, and I understand your arguments. But I do have a couple of questions for Mr. Petrozelli. First of all, Mr. Petrozelli, your motion cites a couple of different sections of the Code of Civil Procedure. And is it your position that those apply to this proceeding, or that those are more in the nature of guidance for the hearing officer?
I would characterize them more in the nature of guidance for the hearing officer. And the board, similar to the approach the board took in the, I want to say it was the Banta Carbona order. The number of the order evades me at the moment. I believe it's cited in the papers.
Okay, well, thank you. And that leads to my next question. The order which you do cite in your papers is Order WR 2016-0015. And I understand what it states about what I'll call motions during the hearing process. Other than that order and the potential guidance from the Code of Civil Procedure sections, are there any other legal authorities regarding the process that you are advocating with a motion for judgment?
Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you. All right, and now I want to go to either Mr. Donlin or whoever is going to speak for BlueTriton Brands. BlueTriton filed a motion for non-suit and/or judgment on February 25, 2022. There was accompanying declaration of Robert Donlin. Mr. Lowe filed a response on February 26th. The prosecution team filed a response on March 16th. And Centers for Biological Diversity and Story of Stuff Project filed joinders in that opposition on March 17. So my questions for Mr. Donlin. Mr. Donlin, your motion cites a Code of Civil Procedure section 581C, subdivision A, for the argument that BlueTriton may bring the motion for non-suit. Is there any other legal authority, again, not for the substance of the argument, but for the process that you are advocating here for the motion for non-suit?
Thank you, Mr. Lilly. I'm going to ask my colleague Shonda Grady to respond as she researched the memorandum that supported our motion.
Okay, so Ms. Grady, if you can answer that question, I would appreciate it.
No, I think we point, as outlined in our brief, to that section of the California Civil Procedure, as well as Water Code 1110A, which discusses the purpose of the Administrative Hearing Office to ensure that water rights matters are resolved in a timely manner. And with that, coupled with section 581C, subsection A, and the BBID case that has been referenced, we argue that the reliance on that code provision for purposes of dismissing this matter at this juncture would be appropriate.
All right, and then just a follow-up question for you, Ms. Grady. The BlueTriton also filed a motion for judgment and cited a Code of Civil Procedure section 631.8, subdivision A. And so it's basically the same question. Other than that authority and the other authorities you just mentioned, are there any other authorities that BlueTriton is asserting support the process for a motion for judgment in this proceeding?
And just for clarity, I apologize if I misunderstood the phrasing of your last question. To be clear, BlueTriton contends that judgment should be issued to dismiss, but no, those two civil code provisions, the water code provision, and the BBID case are the authority upon which we rely for that purpose.
All right, so then my follow-up question is BlueTriton's position, and I'm going to state this as A or B. I think it's either A or B. If you don't think it's either one, you can tell me. But A is that I must grant BlueTriton's motion as a matter of law, or B is that I have discretion to decide whether to grant BlueTriton's motion at this time or to proceed with the remainder of the hearing in this matter. So if you can tell me which of those is BlueTriton's position regarding its motion.
I think to best answer your question, I would state that BlueTriton contends that as a matter of law, the State Water Board prosecution team has failed to present any evidence or even any allegations in the draft cease and desist order to establish that the State Water Board has jurisdiction, permitting authority and therefore jurisdiction to enforce a draft CDO. And on that basis, and now having provided the prosecution team the opportunity to present any evidence and testimony in support of the draft CDO to maybe clarify that issue, and it has not done so, we contend that the State Board does not have any authority and therefore it must be dismissed.
All right, well, I understand that argument, but I don't think that exactly answers my question. My question is a procedural question. Whether at this point in the proceedings, is it your position that I must grant or basically prepare a proposed order for the State Water Board to grant BlueTriton's motion as a matter of law? Or is it your position that I have discretion whether or not to rule on BlueTriton's motion at this time or to proceed with the remainder of the hearing?
Reserving the right to my colleagues to step in and disagree with me, I contend that procedurally you must. Otherwise, it's continuing with a process that's unnecessary and unfounded.
All right, and then so what is your legal authority, if you have any legal authority for that position, other than the statutes and the one State Water Board order you've already stated? Is there any other legal authorities to support that position?
Well, I guess my question would be, I don't understand the authority to continue. If the State Water Board hasn't established its jurisdiction, this seems to be an exercise in prosecutorial misconduct. I mean, it's just continuing a process with no basis in law or in fact. And I don't mean to be that, to state that with disrespect, just I don't understand the process if the foundation isn't established.
All right. All right. I am going to go ahead and issue my rulings on these two motions. First of all, it's my view that the Code of Civil Procedure sections that are cited in the prosecution's team's motion and a motion for judgment and in BlueTriton's motion for non-suit and or judgment do not explicitly apply to this proceeding, although they certainly may provide guidance on how an AHO hearing officer may decide to conduct a hearing. Secondly, the State Water Board Order WR 2016-0015 at pages 11 and 12 held that the State Water Board may consider a motion for judgment during the course of an evidentiary hearing. However, that order then states that the State Board generally does not allow parties to file such motions and that the State Board discourages parties from attempting to do so in future proceedings. So as discussed in my November 4, 2021 rulings in this matter, this hearing involves complex legal issues, many of which are issues of first impression. There also may be some disputed factual issues. The AHO's hearing process has given and will continue to give the parties opportunities to address these issues in detail. And this process will benefit from a complete administrative record, which will be compiled during all phases of this hearing. For these reasons, and exercising my discretion, and I do believe I have discretion regarding the conduct of this proceeding, I deny the prosecution team's motion for judgment, and I deny BlueTriton's motion for non-suit and or judgment. These denials are without prejudice to the rights of the prosecution team, BlueTriton, and other parties to make arguments in their closing briefs that are the same or similar to the arguments the prosecution team and BlueTriton have made in their motions. All right, so next I would like to go to BlueTriton's motions in limine to strike and or exclude San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District's proposed rebuttal testimony and exhibits, and to strike and or exclude Anthony Serrano's proposed rebuttal testimony and exhibits. I have reviewed the two March 1, 2020 motions in limine and the accompanying declaration of Sean DeGrady. I've reviewed Anthony Serrano's March 15, 2022 opposition and San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District's March 16, 2022 opposition. So with this, I'm going to state my proposed ruling, and then I will allow Ms. Nichols or Mr. Bivens to provide any comments. It doesn't appear that Mr. Serrano was on this morning, but he did, and he said he did have a schedule conflict. He sent us an email that said he had a schedule conflict, but I have read his written response to BlueTriton's motion in limine. So here is my proposed ruling. Excuse me, Mr. Donlin, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Lilly. I just wanted to, not to take us backwards, but just wanted to get clarification from you. Will you be issuing a written ruling on the motions for judgment?
I will issue a written order, although it's going to be fairly short, and it's going to basically state the ruling and state for the reasons stated on the record this morning.
Thank you.
But I will do that as soon as I have time. All right, so here is my proposed ruling on the motions in limine. First of all, San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District argues that the written proposed testimony of Wen Huang, and if I'm not saying his name right, I apologize, and the related exhibits do not assert violations of the judgments in the Western Municipal Water District or Orange County Water District cases, and instead just show how BlueTriton's diversion of water affect other water users in the Santa Ana watershed. I'm not sure I agree that this is a valid distinction. I think that really does go to issues regarding violations of the judgments. However, even if that distinction is valid, I think that the proposed testimony nevertheless is outside the scope of this hearing. As I discussed in my November 4, 2021 rulings on pages 7 through 8, the prosecution team's draft CDO does not raise issues regarding water right priorities, impacts on other water users, or violations of these two judgments. Instead, the draft CDO just alleges that BlueTriton violated and is violating the prohibition in Water Code, in Water Code Section 1052, Subdivision A, against unauthorized diversions and use of water, because BlueTriton's diversions are diversions of surface water at rates that exceed the amounts authorized for diversion under BlueTriton's claim pre-1914 appropriative right. For these reasons, my proposed ruling is to grant BlueTriton's motion in limine and not to allow San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District or Anthony Serrano to submit their written proposed rebuttal testimony or their rebuttal exhibits. This ruling would be without prejudice to the rights of all parties, including San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District and Mr. Serrano, to raise these arguments or to make similar arguments in future complaints they may file with the Division of Water Rights Enforcement section. So with that, Ms. Nichol or Mr. Bivens, does either of you want to comment on this proposed ruling?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Lilly. Mr. Bivens is prepared to argue this point. Thank you.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Bivens.
Thank you, Mr. Lilly. I guess the first thing I want to say is the distinction about whether or not Mr. Wang's testimony requires you to consider whether BlueTriton is violating the Western of the Orange County judgments is in fact a pretty important distinction. And it's a distinction that you explicitly recognized in your December pre-hearing conference order, in which you changed the hearing exclusion from any to exclude any issues specifically relating to the Western and Orange County judgment to excluding issues as to whether BlueTriton's violating the Western or Orange County judgments. And I think the record shows, Mr. Lilly, as we said in our brief, that the reason why you drew that distinction is because the Western and Orange County judgments and the way BlueTriton's diversions relate to the diversions of other water users under that judgment are relevant to deciding what the scope of BlueTriton's water rights actually are. In addition, with respect to hearing issue 2, you need to decide not only whether BlueTriton is exceeding its authorized water rights, but also whether, as a matter of policy, the State Water Resources Control Board should issue a cease and desist order. And San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District's position is that the relationship of BlueTriton's diversions to other water users' rights under the Western judgment and the way that BlueTriton's diversions affect other water users in the Santa Ana River watershed is absolutely relevant to the policy issue of whether a cease and desist order should issue.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bivens. I'm going to go ahead and adopt my proposed ruling as my final ruling on these two motions. I still think I'm very concerned that opening the door on this would really broaden the scope of this hearing beyond the scope of the draft CDO. When I issued my amendment to the hearing issues in December, of course, I didn't know exactly what the parties were going to submit in the way of evidence, and certainly not what they'd submit in the way of rebuttal evidence several months later. But I do think there is an important distinction here between what the prosecution team has alleged in the draft CDO and then the scope that San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District and Mr. Serrano are now arguing. I think the prosecution team very clearly has asserted that BlueTriton, if first of all, they've asserted that these are diversions of surface water and therefore are subject to the State Water Board's jurisdiction under the definitions in Water Code Section 1200. And they've also asserted an argument regarding the scope or the amount authorized for diversion under BlueTriton's claim pre-14 right. But that argument regarding the authorized maximum amount of diversion is based solely on issues regarding BlueTriton's predecessor's historical perfection of the appropriative right, and does not in any way get into limitations due to water right priorities, competing claims on the water, impacts on other downstream water users, which of course is what the Western Municipal Water District and Orange County Water District judgments do. So I think even if whether or not the testimony specifically goes to violations of the judgment, I think the testimony does go beyond the scope of what the prosecution team has asserted in the draft CDO. And just so we're clear, I'm not saying that we are limited to exactly the arguments or allegations made in the draft CDO, but I think the general scope of the CDO is that basically the two issues. Number one, does the Water Board have jurisdiction in Water Code Section 1200? And number two, if so, what is the scope of any pre-14 right that BlueTriton and its predecessors may have perfected, but does not go to the issue of competing claims by downstream water users, impacts on them, or general water availability issues. So for those reasons, I'm going to grant both of these motions in limine and not allow the proposed rebuttal testimony from San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District or Mr. Serrano. So with that, I'm going to go forward. The other two motions, no, there are three other motions that I have pending. The first is the prosecution team did file a motion on December 2nd, 2021 to quash BlueTriton's November 30, 2021 subpoena ducis tecum. This motion is still under submission. I will prepare a ruling on it when I have time to do so. In the meantime, the stay I previously issued of the prosecution team's obligation to respond to that subpoena remains in effect. Next, BlueTriton filed a motion on February 17 to quash Story of Stuff Project's February 7, 2022 subpoena ducis tecum. And I'm going to ask the parties, particularly Ms. Doty, to discuss this motion after BlueTriton has presented its rebuttal testimony and exhibits and the cross-examination and questions of Mr. Nichols have been completed. And at that time, just so give you a little advance warning, Ms. Doty, at that time, I will ask you or one of your colleagues to tell me what part of the subpoena seeks documents that Story of Stuff Project still is seeking. And I realized when you submitted the subpoena, you had not seen Mr. Nichols' written proposed testimony, but I'd like to know what parts of the subpoena Story of Stuff Project still is pursuing, if any, and then also explain why I should order BlueTriton to produce those documents. And if necessary, I will certainly give BlueTriton an opportunity to respond to that argument. So in the meantime, the stay I previously issued of BlueTriton's obligation to respond to that subpoena remains in effect. Next, on March 18, last Friday, BlueTriton filed a motion in limine and/or to exclude the prosecution team's proposed rebuttal testimony and exhibits. On this motion, I'm going to rule as follows. This motion asserts that the written proposed testimony of Mr. Eggers and Ms. Stork does not rebut testimony presented by other parties during their cases in chief. This assertion may or may not be correct as to some or all of the various elements of their written proposed rebuttal testimony. However, even if some parts of their written proposed rebuttal testimony do not rebut specific testimony presented by other parties in their cases in chief, those parts also may nevertheless rebut the extensive written proposed rebuttal testimony and rebuttal exhibits that BlueTriton has submitted for this rebuttal phase of this hearing. So rather than spending the considerable effort that would be needed to sort out exactly what parts of Mr. Eggers and Ms. Stork's written proposed testimony rebut what other testimony, I'm going to allow them to submit and summarize their written proposed testimony. I make this ruling exercising my hearing officer's discretion in the conduct of this hearing, and also as stated on page 11 of the November 17, 2021 notice of second pre-hearing conference and public hearing. The AHO hearing officer may amend the procedure stated in the notice before, during, or after the hearing as he or she deems appropriate. And for this one, the proposed rebuttal testimony is fairly short, and frankly, I'm going to exercise my discretion to allow it rather than to parse out exactly whether or not it follows the specific rules of rebuttal. So with that, I think that covers all of the motions that are pending before me at this time. Have I missed any motions? Okay, hearing none, I think I've covered them all. The next thing I wanted to advise you all on is that I have prepared a list of files that my office, the Administrative Hearings Office, plans to offer into evidence in this proceeding. And I have saved that file in a new folder called AHO Staff Exhibits, which was within the party's hearing exhibits folder. And that lists the following four files, which are sets of files, which we've labeled as follows. And you can, when we have a break, you can go look at that list. But AHO1 is all files in the folder titled Groundwater Extraction Notices, which is part of the administrative record for this proceeding. AHO2 is all files in the folder labeled AHO Staff Photos. That's from the February 16, 17 site visit. AHO3 is all files in the folder titled AHO Staff Video plus Audio Recordings from the same site visit. And then AHO4 is all files in the folder titled San Manuel Band Mission Indians Photos. They submitted, I think it was approximately seven photographs with some short captions of those. And as stated in the notice I filed in the AHO Staff Exhibits folder, the last three of these folders are within the site visit folder, which is within the hearing documents folder in the administrative record in this matter. And also, just so you all know, in the site visit folder, I also added an attendance spreadsheet, which lists the people who attended all or part of each day of the site visit. I didn't have sufficient records to spell out exactly who attended which part on each day, but I did have a record of who at least participated at the beginning of the site visit on each day. For the second day, I think it was pretty clear because either people were on the helicopter or they were not. I'm not going to offer that file into evidence, but I did want to let you know it's in the record, just so we have a record of who attended. So Mr. Anderson of my staff is completing the redactions of sensitive information, and I think it was 4 of the videos that he sent to BlueTriton, and then Mr. Sanders responded to with some concerns about those potentially sensitive information. And we had agreed during the site visit that we would take care to avoid having the videos display any sensitive information. The administrative record in this matter is password protected, but many people can get the password and access it. So even though it's not posted on a public website, we certainly still want to respect BlueTriton's concerns about that sensitive information. So after he does that, he will add the files of those 4 videos to the folder of the AHO staff video and audio recordings. So I'm going to give everybody an opportunity, since this is the first notice you've had of this, when we have a break or this sometime after we conclude today, to look over those files just to see whether or not anybody has any objections to those being admitted into evidence. And I will, at the end of the hearing, either this afternoon, if we finish that quickly, or tomorrow, more likely tomorrow, I will bring this issue up again and we'll discuss it at that time. See what else I have here. So let me just make sure, first of all, does anybody have any other pending issues that they believe we need to cover before we start the rebuttal evidence phase of this hearing? All right, hearing none, we will go forward. For presentation of the party's rebuttal testimony and exhibits, because we've already heard extensive testimony, and my colleagues and I now have conducted the site visit, we certainly are far more familiar with this matter, particularly the underlying facts, than we were when we started this hearing. So I'm going to limit the party's summaries of their rebuttal testimony to 30 minutes. I think that will be plenty. We don't need nearly as much detail as we did the first time around. And then we will follow our process of allowing other parties to conduct cross-examination. I will ask questions if I have any, and I will allow redirect examination if necessary. So the order of proceeding for rebuttal evidence will be the prosecution team, then Steve Lowe, and then BlueTriton. And after we complete these parties' rebuttal cases, I will ask the parties whether any party wants to present rebuttal testimony and exhibits, and if so, we'll discuss the process to that. And then, as I previously mentioned, we will move into the parties filing written closing briefs. And as I said before, after those written closing briefs are filed, I will allow any party to file objections to any hearsay evidence that is cited in any other party's written closing brief. And in those objections, discuss how I should apply Government Code Section 11513 subdivision D to that evidence. I will set that deadline in the notice regarding closing briefs, but it'll probably be approximately 2 weeks after the deadline for closing briefs. So with that, I'll just pause one more time and ask if there are any questions. Otherwise, we will proceed with the prosecution team's witnesses and exhibits. Mr. Fry, your hand is up.
Since the day you did the site visit and I wasn't able to attend, are you going to come back and see it under other conditions, the site?
I, at this point, do not intend to. It's a certain, I mean, I do understand that there was snow. I remember there was snow on the ground, so we certainly couldn't see the, I'll say, the surface hydrology features, you know, where water was flowing and where the ground was dry. And that was unfortunate, but we had picked a date, and logistically it took a fair amount of effort to go ahead and schedule that. So at this time, I do not plan to go back. But if you or anyone else thinks there's a reason why I should, I'll certainly consider that. Probably the best thing would be, well, why don't, if you want to say something now, go ahead. I was going to say, otherwise people can file written comments, but go ahead if you want to say something about that now.
That day was an atypical day, and especially for the site. And I don't think it fairly represents what is occurring at the site, and you really could not see the ground after looking at the pictures. And so I would request that you return.
Okay, well, we will consider that. I mean, in a perfect world, that would make sense. Obviously, there are a lot of logistical challenges and expenses involved here that may limit our ability to do that perfect world. I will note, we certainly were able to see the facilities, and we could see where water was coming out of some of the facilities, and Mr. Lawrence did an excellent job of explaining how it all worked, and we saw the lay of the land. But I do understand that there were some limitations because of the snow on the ground. So, Ms. Fry, something else?
Right. Okay. I just think that this is not a case about BlueTriton's facilities and their pipes and vaults. So that's just my point. And for this, I think most citizens in California, you know, are interested in what is occurring at the site. So thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, and we were taken a little by surprise. I had been carefully checking the weather forecast the days before, and the forecast was for 1 to 3 inches of snow that night. And I knew it was generally south-facing slopes, and it was going to be sunny the days we were out there, and I was pretty sure the snow would melt. We ended up getting more like 1 to 2 feet of snow, which obviously took a lot longer to melt. Wreaked a little havoc on everybody's drives up there, although I think everybody finally got there, and it was a little bit of a challenge to walk around, but we were all good troopers and slogged through the snow, and we got around. So anyway, I understand your comment, Ms. Fry, but I hope you understand the logistical challenges I'm dealing with this many parties, and particularly many of us having to come from Northern California. So Mr. Bielecki, your hand is up. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Lilly. I would like to echo and support Amanda Fry's comments a moment ago. And yes, we were able to see the facilities themselves, I think, well. And yet, you know, the degree of snowfall completely obscured the surface topography, which and all the visits I've had to these multiple sites is very different, and I think illustrates a different picture than what we were seeing on that day.
All right. Well, and I certainly understand your point. And you have submitted some photographs as well under other conditions, which are helpful and are in the administrative record. So we will consider that. I will discuss that with my colleagues, and we will discuss whether or not to do that. And obviously, we'll notify the parties if we decide we want to go back.
Thank you.
I will say one thing: we didn't encounter any rattlesnakes, so that was good. Some advantages to having cold conditions. Maybe that is the only one, but there was that one. All right, so let's go ahead with the prosecution team's witnesses and exhibits. Let me just shift my papers over here. So I have received exhibits PT 312 through PT 314. And it appears that the prosecution team plans to call 2 rebuttal witnesses, Tomas Eggers and Natalie Stork. Mr. Petrozelli, is that correct?
Yes, and if we may have a moment before we start to shift gears and take any biological breaks that
okay.
before we transition.
All right, let's do I have 9:43 right now. We'll take a break until 9:50. We've only been going for 45 minutes, so I'm not going to take our full morning break, mid-morning break yet, but we'll take a break till 9:50, and come back then. So I'll see you all then. Please don't log off, but you can turn off your microphone and camera if you want to. All right, we're just waiting for Mr. Petrozelli and Ms. Stork. There's Mr. Petrozelli. And we just need Ms. Stork to appear. There's Ms. Stork. Okay. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. Mr. Eggers and Ms. Stork, you both took the oath previously during this proceeding, and you're still under oath. So I'm just going to do the quick preliminary questions. Mr. Eggers, is Exhibit PT 312 your rebuttal testimony for this hearing?
That's correct.
And Ms. Stork, is Exhibit PT 313 your rebuttal testimony for this hearing?
Yes.
All right, Mr. Petrozelli, you may proceed to ask Mr. Eggers and Ms. Stork to summarize their written rebuttal testimony. Again, as you know, the caveat, summaries are limited to summarizing what is here, and I will allow you a maximum of 30 minutes total for these two witnesses to summarize their testimony, but their written testimony is fairly short, and I have read it all very carefully, so I'm not sure 30-minute summaries are necessary. But please proceed, and then after you do that, I will allow other parties and their representatives to conduct cross-examination.
Mr. Eggers and Ms. Stork, would you please proceed with summarizing your testimony?
We have to ask one of them to go first. So which one do you want to go first?
So Mr. Eggers, would you please begin?
Morning. My name is Tomas Eggers. I'm a water resource control engineer for the enforcement section of the Division of Water Rights. Ms. Stork and I each submitted written rebuttal testimony, but will present a summary of our testimony together. My rebuttal testimony is offered into evidence as Exhibit PT 312. Can we start by putting Exhibit PT 314 on the screen?
All right, Ms. Mullen, if you can please screen share and put PT 314 on the screen. Give us just one moment. It's a big file, so it'll take a minute to upload it. All right, and just tell us where you want us to scroll or zoom, Mr. Eggers.
Just zoom out to see more of it, I suppose. That's fine. Exhibit PT 314 is an expanded view of a portion of the USGS hydrologic map of San Bernardino, Redlands, and vicinity, prepared by W.C. Mendenhall and J.B. Lippincott in 1905. The original map covers a large portion of the Santa Ana River watershed and was submitted into evidence as SOS 91. Exhibit PT 314 includes only a small section of this map in the vicinity of Upper Strawberry Canyon, including the locations of the springs from which the respondent diverts water for its spring water bottling operations. I prepared Exhibit PT 314 because SOS 91 lacks important specificity, clarity, and context regarding the intermittent and perennial nature of Strawberry Creek immediately below the respondent's current points of diversion. In my written testimony, I describe how we prepared the exhibit. First, we imported a raster image of SOS 91 into ArcMap. Since a raster does not include geolocating data by default, the next step was to georeference the raster, providing it location information. Next, we added green dots to represent the location of the respondent's PODs, based on location data provided by the respondent. Yellow dots to represent the location of other PODs based on location data obtained from eRIMS, and stream flow lines obtained from the National Hydrography Dataset Plus version 2, NHD, which we represented with red dashed lines. Finally, we traced the solid and dashed lines on the 1905 map with bright blue solid and dashed lines on a separate layer within ArcMap to increase their visible detail and contrast. Because the 1905 map includes hand-drawn contour lines to depict the topology of a very large area, the map may be inaccurate at the small scales represented in Exhibit PT 314. There may be discrepancies between the 1905 map and the actual topology of the area that cannot be rectified during the georeferencing process.
Can I interrupt for one moment, please?
Go ahead, do you have an objection?
I do, and I think this is the appropriate point to note that we object to the document identified as SOS 91, which was also identified as FR 62, to the extent that Mr. Eggers and Ms. Stork are now seeking to submit this document for uncorroborated hearsay purposes, meaning they are seeking to assert that the information provided in the map identified as being created in 1905, which is outside of this hearing, is being offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted in that map, and doing so for purposes of comparison to information that they are providing gathered today.
All right. That objection is overruled. I don't think a map is a statement, so I don't think the hearsay rule applies to it. Ms. Grady, I assume at the end of this presentation, Mr. Petrozelli will offer this exhibit PT 314 into evidence, and at that point you can raise what objections you have regarding the exhibit. But I'm going to overrule the objection as far as allowing him to continue to summarize his testimony. So with that, Mr. Eggers, you may proceed.
As I was saying, there may be discrepancies between the 1905 map and the actual topology of the area that cannot be rectified during the georeferencing process. Consequently, PT 314 may not accurately reflect the distances between the topographic features depicted on the 1905 map and the overlaid features. The portion of the 1905 map included in PT 314 depicts Strawberry Creek with a solid blue line in the vicinity of boreholes 10, 11, and 12. Moving north, we see that this stream channel splits and is depicted with two dashed blue lines that continue generally northward in two of the topographical drainages in Upper Strawberry Canyon. The eastern streamline reaches a point on the figure populated by the green dots representing the boreholes of the Spring 7 complex, while the western line passes between the location of borehole 1, 1A, and 8 and Spring Tunnel 2. It is reasonable to infer from the symbology used on the 1905 map that intermittent streams were observed in the immediate vicinity of both groups of springs from which the respondent diverts. We can also infer that in 1905...
Excuse me, please.
Go ahead if you want.
This is where I would raise the objection again, to the extent that Mr. Eggers is testifying what the map says, explaining it as what he can infer it means. That is using information noted on a map as a statement offered in 1905 out of court to prove the truth of the representation as noted in the map. So in other words, the notation on the map represents a statement as to what it reflects.
All right,
And that is that-
the objection is overruled. As I said before, a map is not a hearsay. It's not a statement, so the hearsay rule doesn't apply. Secondly, Mr. Eggers has previously testified that in a manner that demonstrates he has sufficient expertise to interpret a map like this. This is exactly the sort of thing that qualified engineers like Mr. Eggers testify to. So I think he is allowed to testify that it's within the scope of his expertise. So, yeah, Mr. Eggers, you may proceed.
We can also infer that in 1905, the streams were observed at or above the elevations of both groups of spring diversions. Ms. Stork will now explain more about the symbology of the map.
Good morning. My name is Natalie Stork. I'm a senior engineering geologist with the Office of Research, Planning, and Performance. My rebuttal testimony is offered into evidence as Exhibit PT 313. I would like to make a correction to my testimony. Page 3, line 8 of my testimony says perennial stream instead of intermittent stream. I would like to correct this.
I'm sorry, you went a little fast. What page and what line number?
I apologize. Page 3, line 8.
Okay, so you want to change the word perennial to the word intermittent?
Yes.
All right, thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you. All right. Exhibit PT 314 depicts the 1905 map with the respondent's points of diversion. The 1905 map shows the topography and the location of streams as surveyed prior to 1905, but that map does not show current points of interest relevant to this proceeding, such as springs 1 through 3, 7, 10 through 12, here on out described as the Arrowhead Springs. The 1905 map shows brown topographic contours and solid blue lines, as well as dashed blue lines. Solid blue lines indicate perennial streams, while dashed blue lines indicate intermittent streams on topographical maps. Mr. Eggers described the orientation of intermittent and perennial streams in the 1905 map in his testimony. The location of the two intermittent streams described by Mr. Eggers is different from the location of streams shown today in the National Hydrography Dataset, or NHD, displayed in PT 314. The NHD, displayed here in red, shows an intermittent stream segment flowing from above and to the west of Spring 3 down to the meadow, and does not show any stream segments in the vicinity of Springs 1 and 8 or Spring 7. While the 1905 map shows that there were streams next to the springs before the respondent began diversion from the springs, the NHD shown in PT 314 indicates that there are no longer streams next to these springs. The existence of the intermittent streams in the 1905 map prior to development of the springs and the lack of those intermittent streams in the NHD indicates that flow from these unaltered springs would have discharged to natural channels prior to being developed. Mr. Eggers, can you please continue?
I'm now going to talk about compliance implementation. We believe compliance implementation is feasible, even if the respondent needs to modify its existing system. During the site visit, the prosecution team observed BTB's BlueTriton Brands' use of programmable logic controllers, PLCs, to measure flows and transmit data from some of the spring PODs, and several methods of generating power. The prosecution team also observed that cellular signal from common US carriers was strong at each of the POD locations. With the potential addition of mechanically operated valves, the same general methods of monitoring, control, and power generation we observed can feasibly be adapted to implement compliance actions.
Excuse me, the testimony regarding observations in the field is not in the written testimony.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I think he's allowed to draw on his testimony from the first round of the hearing where he did talk about his field work to prepare his rebuttal here. So the objection is overruled.
I apologize. I misunderstood and thought he was speaking about the field visit of the group. Is that not correct, Mr. Eggers?
Well, and excuse me, this is not the time for cross-examination. You'll get your chance for that. To the extent he is, I consider that to be an appropriate thing for him to testify to as part of his rebuttal. So you may proceed, Mr. Eggers.
Ms. Stork, please continue.
Next, I would like to discuss analysis of the flows from Spring 7. Can we start by putting exhibit PT 315 on the screen, please?
And I just want to state, I previously misspoke. I only identified exhibits PT 312 to 314 as rebuttal exhibits, but PT 315 also was submitted as a rebuttal exhibit, and it is now on the screen. So Ms. Stork, you may proceed.
Thank you. An analysis of the notes on individual springs produced by John F. Mann Jr. in 1988.
Excuse me, I need to object again. As noted in our motion in limine, we object to the document identified as SOS 12. It is not clear the veracity of this document. The document itself appears to be a collection of different documents, as evidenced by the difference in page numbering on each of the pages. The source of the document is not clear. It is only testified to as something that was included in a compendium of documents that was in an administrative record, but the original source of the document was never identified. And it's being relied upon for the truth of the matter asserted.
All right, I'm going to overrule the objection. I think this is the type of document that a technical expert like Ms. Stork can rely on, the technical experts like her do rely on in their work. I think the objection goes to the weight of the evidence, not the admissibility. You may raise this issue during your cross-examination of Ms. Stork, but I'm going to allow her to testify, and the objection is overruled. Go ahead, Ms. Stork.
Thank you. An analysis of the notes on individual springs produced by John F. Mann Jr. in 1988, identified as Story of Stuff Exhibit 12, calls into question whether there is any water present at the Spring 7 complex that the respondent would have a right to divert without authorization from the State Water Board. I performed an analysis of information in Story of Stuff Exhibit 12, which describes the flow of Spring Tunnel 7 before and after development of the Spring 7 boreholes, as well as flow from these boreholes during the period of 1945 to 1985. A comparison between the flow of Spring Tunnel 7 and the 7A and 7B boreholes indicates that there is no new water flowing from the boreholes beyond what was originally flowing in the tunnel, indicating that the boreholes did not develop any new water. To evaluate the data in Story of Stuff Exhibit 12, I tabulated the flow measurements in the report from 1945 to 1961. There is a year after year set of August readings for Spring Tunnel 7 from 1946 to 1949, and a year after year set of August readings for boreholes 7A and 7B from 1953 to 1957. I compared these two sets of readings specifically because those measurements provide data that cover the same part of the year and therefore are within the same part of the annual cycle of peak flow and low flow. When I compared the flow measurements from these subsets, I determined that the average annual flow was approximately equal, indicating that no developed water was present. Since the flow from all springs, tunnels, and borings is affected by precipitation in the area, I compared annual precipitation data against the flow measurements. The average annual precipitation across the two time periods was equal, so the two flow measures are comparable. Based on the lack of evidence for developed water in the analysis, there may be no need to bypass developed water from the Spring 7 complex. It is not clear that the boreholes below Spring 7 have added any new water to the Strawberry Creek watershed that the respondent could divert without a valid basis of right. This concludes our presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. With that, I'm going to allow the parties and their representatives to ask cross-examination questions, and we'll start with BlueTriton. Who for BlueTriton, which attorney wants to ask cross-examination questions of these witnesses?
Mr. Lilly, this is Chris Sanders, and I'll be doing the cross-examination.
All right, Mr. Sanders, good morning, and you may proceed.
Thank you. And I'll address this to the panel. Either one of you wants to answer it, unless I specifically ask a couple of questions, and a few of the questions will be directed at individuals. So in the rebuttal testimony that both of you presented, which was essentially identical, you indicate that you are rebutting the testimony of story of stuff. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What SOS testimony are you rebutting?
It's the map that was presented does not provide the context, the clarity that was needed to evaluate it and come to conclusions.
So you are.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. You are rebutting SOS 91.
We are providing additional context regarding that exhibit that was not provided.
Okay, because things changed later, you don't think that map is accurate?
That the testimony that was provided on the map and the map itself did not come with sufficient context to evaluate it properly.
And what was the testimony that was provided regarding that map?
I don't recall all the testimony.
Okay. Can we please bring up, well, let's bring up your testimony, PT 312.
Okay, Ms. Mullen, please display exhibit PT 312. And Mr. Sanders, let us know where you want us to scroll and zoom to.
Sure, page 2, paragraph 2, line approximately 7.5.
Okay, we have paragraph 2 up on the screen now.
So please read for me a portion of your testimony that begins Ms. Fry's testimony.
Was there a question there?
I'm asking
not
you
yet.
to,
Mr. Eggers, just stand by. Mr. Sanders is still formulating his question.
I'm asking you to read the sentence that begins Ms. Fry's testimony.
And Mr. Sanders, just please clarify, do you want him to read it to himself or out loud?
Out loud, please.
All right. Mr. Eggers, please go ahead.
Ms. Fry's testimony, the 1905 map, indicated that Strawberry Creek was a perennial stream, which is not the case today, lacks important specificity, clarity, and context regarding the intermittent and perennial nature of Strawberry Creek immediately below the respondent's current points of diversion.
Is this the extent of Ms. Fry's testimony that you are rebutting?
That's part of it, but it's the general context and the lack of context or specificity.
What else are you rebutting? Because it did not appear to be in your written testimony.
The context, providing additional context that was not provided.
Can you provide context to a map that changes at some point in the future?
I don't understand the question. Can I provide context to a map? Yes.
You're asking, you say that SOS 91 does not provide sufficient clarity, and that was the reason you had to offer testimony. Is that correct?
Excuse me, Mr. Sanders. I don't know whether this is intentional or not, but I think you are misstating what this sentence says. The sentence says her testimony lacks important specificity, clarity, and context, not that the map lacks important specificity, clarity, and context.
But Mr. Eggers just testified that the map did not have sufficient clarity either.
All right, so why don't you go ahead and restate your question, and then Mr. Eggers may respond.
Okay, maybe I'll ask, what portion of Ms. Fry's testimony do you refute?
Well, she indicated that Strawberry Creek was a perennial stream. Portions of it were a perennial stream, not all of it. It wasn't clear from providing a very large map which portions. Furthermore, they weren't in context because they did not show current points of interest. We created an exhibit that does those things.
So my question, sorry, and I apologize, I didn't mean to talk over you. My question is, how does a 1905 map include information that's not yet available until many, many years later?
How does it include information that I don't understand? We created PT 314, the map that we put those features on.
And so you are rebutting a 1905 map because it didn't include information that happened many years later. Is that correct?
No.
So explain to me what the problems with the 1905 map were.
That it wasn't put into context by the testimony, and that it lacked specificity and clarity.
What portion of the
testimony that accompanied it?
What portion of the 1905 map lacked specificity or clarity?
The testimony did not provide sufficient context, specificity, and clarity. And so we remedied that by creating a zoomed in version that focused in on the subject area and provided additional context.
Okay. Please bring up exhibit SOS 91.
All right, Ms. Mullen, please, you can take this exhibit down and get up exhibit SOS 91. And again, I think it's a file with a lot of megabytes, so it may take a minute for it to appear here. All right, so Mr. Sanders, please let us know if you want us to zoom in on any particular portion of this exhibit.
Sure. Mr. Eggers, do you recognize this exhibit?
I do.
And what is the title of this exhibit?
Hydrologic map of San Bernardino, Redlands, and vicinity.
And the remainder of the title? Maybe we can we enlarge that upper right-hand corner showing the legend, please?
Yeah, why don't you zoom it out? Zoom it out one or two more clicks, Miss Mullen. So, okay, that looks good. So what else?
Showing,
Okay.
okay.
Oh, go ahead, Mr.
Hydrologic
Davis.
map of San Bernardino, Redlands, and vicinity showing irrigated lands by W.C. Mendenhall and J.B. Lippincott, 1905.
Thank you. And what is the source of this exhibit?
The USGS.
Where was this map originally developed? What document was this map originally developed for?
I don't know.
Can you please read the upper right corner of SOS 91?
Water supply paper number 142. I can't read the rest.
Ms. Mullen, can you scroll over a little bit to the right? There we go. Maybe make that.
PL 12.
Okay. And does that suggest the source?
I don't know.
Okay. Please bring up exhibit SOS 001.
Okay, we will get SOS 1.
And Ms. Stork, if you happen to know the answers, please offer them.
Okay, I can probably answer some of your previous questions if you wanted me to.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Sanders, I mean, I know you're doing the best you can here, but try to direct your questions to one witness or the other. That'll avoid some confusion.
Okay, I'm attempting to accommodate your earlier statement to me that I should be addressing questions to the panel. So,
okay.
I will do whatever you request, Mr. Lilly. I don't mean to be sarcastic about that.
No, I apologize if I'm giving you inconsistent directions, but just do, if you want to ask them both, do, but just sort of try to make it clear. And at this point, I think your questions are from Ms. Stork, so go ahead.
Okay. Ms. Stork, do you recognize this exhibit?
Yes.
And what is the title of this exhibit?
I refer to it as water supply paper number 142. Here it also says water supply and irrigation paper number 142.
Okay. And was this the source of SOS 91?
If the map said number 142, yes. I know Mr. Eggers read it just a moment ago, but I know that was plate 12 from a USGS report.
Okay. I believe we could probably go to the next page, page 2 of this.
All right, we'll try to scroll to page 2.
And it should, if I'm not mistaken, let's keep on scrolling down, please. Further. Maybe one more page. My apologies.
Hopefully they're realistic plates.
Okay,
yes.
Right there. So plate 12, the hydrologic map of San Bernardino, Redlands, and vicinity showing irrigated lands. Is that the title that was shown on SOS 91?
I believe so.
Okay. What was the purpose of the report SOS 001?
I haven't read the entire report in over 5 years, so I can only infer from the name, but yeah, I could only infer from the name. I haven't read it in over 5 years, so I do not recall.
Okay. Is it correct that the purpose of the report was just to describe the water supply for the San Bernardino Valley?
What was the title of the report again? I'm sorry.
What, Ms.
I
Muller,
believe
why don't you
so.
scroll up to the first page again and maybe that'll
Sorry,
help.
sorry, I'm being such a stickler for
No apologies needed.
get these correct. Yes, it's the hydrology of San Bernardino Valley, California.
Okay,
The title speaks for itself.
thank you. Did SOS 001 provide flow records for East Twin Creek?
I don't recall.
If we scrolled to the next page, page 2, would that refresh your memory?
Possibly, yeah.
A little bit further down. Okay, you can stop there.
Tables of flow, East Twin Creek.
Okay. Did SOS 001 provide flow records for West Twin Creek?
According to this table of contents, yes.
Did SOS 001 provide flow records for Strawberry Creek?
According to this table of contents, no.
Did SOS 001 provide any description of the standards used to distinguish between perennial, intermittent, or ephemeral streams?
I don't recall.
Mr. Eggers, do you know the answer?
I don't recall.
Did SOS 001 describe seasonal field work that may have been conducted to distinguish between perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral conditions on SOS 091?
If you're asking me, I don't recall.
Okay, so my apologies. Thank you. Mr. Eggers?
I don't recall.
Did SOS 001 describe any mapping standards used to develop yes, did any standards, well, let me strike that. Do you have any independent knowledge of how the hydrologic information reflected on SOS 91 was developed?
I may have some, since I have an understanding of how topo maps were made historically.
Okay, and could you describe that?
Yeah, a surveyor would go out with surveying equipment and survey the entire area.
Would they do it? Sorry, my apologies.
I was going to say it's a very time intensive and laborious process.
Would they do it at different times of the year?
Yes. If for a map like this, I expect it would probably take several years, if not even longer, to develop the topography and collect information on the hydrology.
And how many times would they have gone out there?
I can't say.
And do you have any evidence that they did that for the preparation of this map?
It's a very large map, so it would have taken them extensive amounts of time to develop the map, especially prior to when we had airplanes and aerial flights and satellite data.
Okay. Please bring up SOS 091.
We'll go back to SOS 0, or maybe go to SOS 091. Or back to it, yes. Thank you.
I want to focus in on Strawberry Canyon, which is toward the upper middle portion. So if you can zoom in.
Maybe click a couple more times. There we go. And scroll down just a little bit. Other way. Maybe up is what I meant.
Okay. And you see toward the top where it says Squirrel Inn right above the N and the A of San Bernardino?
Yeah, so Ms. Mullen, why don't you expand out, zoom out, make it bigger, one notch bigger. If you can. Other way. And one more, there we go. That's good. Perfect. Right there. Thank you. Now go ahead, Mr. Sanders. I just thought it was a little easier to read this
Probably
way.
good enough. In your testimony, and I'll start with Ms. Stork, since your testimonies were almost identical. You referred to the meadow, and above the meadow, that Strawberry Creek splits into 2 channels. Is that correct?
I believe so.
That was in my testimony, but yes.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
And you're right, Mr. Eggers. I do have that. And above the confluence, SOS 91 depicts the 2 channels with dashed blue lines. Is that correct?
If you would zoom in more.
All right, let's make it, if you can, Ms. Mullen, one bigger.
In fact, if you zoom in quite a bit more, you can see the dashes, but
We can zoom in another notch here. Okay, is that good, Mr. Eggers?
yes.
Okay. And just for the record, I think the 2 channels are just below the big A, which was part of San Bernardino. So go ahead, Mr. Sanders, go ahead with your next.
Correct. So above the confluence depicts 2 channels with dashed blue lines. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And below the confluence, SOS 91 depicts Strawberry Creek with a solid blue line. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what does the solid blue line depict?
Natalie?
Since I testified on the symbology, I can say that that's a perennial stream.
Can you point me to any legend on this map that verifies that?
We'd have to zoom out. I would hope it's on the legend, but if it's not on the legend, this is established standard practice when depicting streams in topographical maps.
Can you, we can certainly look at the legend if you want.
It's up to you, Mr. Sanders. You're asking the questions. Do you want us to zoom out?
Yes.
All right, let's go ahead. If we can zoom out, Ms. Mullen.
And the legend's in the upper right-hand corner of this document.
Okay, it's got a lot of megabytes, so it takes a minute for the computer to respond, but we're getting there. And Ms. Mullen, scroll over to the right side if you can. Okay, so go ahead and ask your question again.
Is there anything on this legend that verifies what either a solid blue line or a dashed blue line represents?
No.
And can you point me to any authority that existed in 1905 regarding what a dashed blue line or a solid blue line means?
I can't, but I'd like to add some nuance to that.
Please go ahead and explain what, based on your knowledge, to the extent you have knowledge on this question.
Yeah, so I've reviewed a fairly extensive number of historical topographic maps when I worked for the Division of Water Rights in the enforcement section. And standard practice was that a solid blue line was a perennial stream and a dashed blue line was an intermittent stream.
Was that also the case? Oops, I'm sorry.
Sorry, no, I'll go ahead and end it there.
Was that the case for topographic maps that were for the purpose of showing irrigated lands?
For all topographic maps.
And that standard existed in 1905?
Based on the extensive number of really old topographic maps that I've reviewed, I would say yes.
Do you have any evidence that that was the case in 1905, though?
I think the body of work of USGS topographical maps at the time sort of speaks to that, but other than that, no.
Okay. Is it possible that a dashed line on this map indicates an ephemeral stream?
I would say an ephemeral stream is also an intermittent stream.
Okay. Does SOS 91 identify all of the drainages and gullies with a blue line?
It doesn't identify every single drainage or gully, but I'd like to add a little bit to that.
Please.
Since this map was created before there were aerial flights and before there were satellites, that means a person actually went and surveyed this entire area and would have looked and made a judgment call about whether to map a drainage as a perennial stream or intermittent stream, to the best of my knowledge.
Okay. But we have no evidence as to what type of surveying was done for preparation of this map.
I don't know of types of surveying. I know of surveying itself. I can refer that to Moss since he's an engineer and engineers have special knowledge of surveying.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Eggers. Mr. Sanders is trying the best he can to focus his questions on one witness or another, but if you can add anything on that, please go ahead.
I don't have anything to add on that. I'm not aware of the type of surveying.
All right, Mr. Sanders, you may proceed.
Thank you. Please bring up exhibit PT 314.
All right, we'll get PT 314 on the screen. And let us know whether you want us to zoom or scroll, Mr. Sanders.
Sure. Let's just for right now, we're okay right where it is. That's fine. Who prepared this map?
The prosecution team.
Okay, so Mr. Eggers, Mr. Sanders is trying really hard to figure out who to ask questions of. Okay. So if you can be clear between you and Ms. Stork, I think it would help him.
This is Tomas Eggers, the prosecution team prepared
Who
this map.
Who within the prosecution team prepared this map, Mr. Eggers?
This was a collaborative effort. There's not one person.
Who was involved with the preparation of this map? Who in particular?
Can I volunteer some information?
Sure.
Please.
Just to be really specific. So Tomas did a lot of the mechanics of assembling the different layers into the map, and I provided guidance on where to find certain layers of information and techniques.
And other members provided their input and approval.
How many additional and who were they, Mr. Eggers?
I'm not aware of everybody who looked over the map.
You indicated that there were numerous. How do you know that?
There are many members of the prosecution team.
And please name the members that you know of that were involved.
All of the members of the prosecution team. Would you like me to name everyone? I mean, and first of all, I don't know who reviewed it, but everybody up the chain is involved in reviewing and approving.
But you indicated that there were numerous people that reviewed it and had input in its preparation. I'm just asking who those people were.
And I'm saying that I don't know all of them.
Okay, so if you don't know all of them, please tell me the ones you do know.
Well, I know that Ms. Stork and I prepared this and provided it to the team for review and approval.
So you don't know anybody else?
I I know everybody on the prosecution team. I don't know exactly what they did with the document once it was provided to them.
So were there changes made to the document that you
Not
were
that I'm
unaware
aware
of?
of.
But there could have been.
Not that I'm aware of.
But there could have been. Is that correct?
I suppose there could have been.
Answered.
Thank you. Can we scroll down on this map, please? Right there, please. Thanks. There's a purple line across the bottom of this map, and the legend identifies it as the Del Rosa line. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Does the Del Rosa line have anything to do with the rebuttal testimony today?
The Del Rosa line was a context, but I did not reference it in the testimony.
Okay, thank you. Please bring up PT 312, page 2.
All right, we'll get PT 312, page 2, and let us know where you want to scroll to.
Sure, on line 25, and this is a request of Mr. Eggers. Can you please read the single sentence that begins on line 25 with the word finally?
Finally, we added a stream channel layer from the National Hydrologic Dataset, NHD, JS server to depict the flow lines mapped on current USGS publications.
And did you mean the National Hydrographic Dataset?
I believe so.
Okay. Does the NHD use multiple sources for its data?
Could you clarify the question?
What does NHD use as sources for its data?
Ms. Stork, would you like to answer this question?
Oh, I am trying to recall. It has been a while. I've had conversations with the woman who is the curator for the California NHD. It is a collection of GIS data.
Okay. And do you know from whom those sources are provided?
I don't know precisely, but I know that Jane Schaefer Kramer at the Department of Water Resources is the lead sort of curator for the California NHD Plus effort.
Okay, thank you. So do you know the source of the specific NHD data that was used for Strawberry Canyon, Ms. Stork? And my apologies.
Since it's in California, the source that I would attribute it to is Jane Schaefer Kramer.
And she works for whom?
She works for DWR, but she is, I forget her exact title, but she's the lead for NHD Plus.
And so this is DWR's data that are being utilized for this
It's
map?
USGS's data, but Jane Schaefer Kramer works for DWR.
Okay, so
to the best of my knowledge.
So the source, so let me go back to my question. Do you know the source of the data used for Strawberry Canyon?
I guess precisely no.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Can we please bring up 314 again?
Okay, we'll put up exhibit PT 314 again. Let us know where you want us to zoom and scroll to.
Sure, if we could zoom out just a little bit.
Okay.
That's fine, thank you. The red line on PT 314 is based on information you imported from the NHD. Is that correct?
I can answer that, yes.
Okay. And why is the red NHD line outside the channel of the 1905 map?
Tomas, do you want to speak to this one?
Yeah, the NHD line is, that's from a layer that was produced recently. This map is the 1905 map. It's a raster map that was geo-referenced. And so the geo-referencing process involves taking known points that you can identify on the map and the base map in ArcGIS and using the software to stretch and transform the map so that it basically lines up those points with the least amount of distance between the control points. And so that's called rectifying. And it doesn't exactly match each place along the entire map. It only tries to minimize the distance between the control points. So that's why I said in my testimony that there could be inaccuracies. So there's several different places where this particular inaccuracy could come from, either from the original map being slightly off relative to the actual topology, or from a distance created by the rectifying not being a perfect process.
Okay. And Mr. Eggers, why do the blue lines not appear to follow the channel defined by the topography?
That's how they were mapped.
Okay. And Mr. Eggers, why does the NHD flow line turn left at the top of Strawberry Canyon, just above the large A, and extend to an area that did not have a flow line in 1905?
That's how it was mapped.
Are there any water diversion facilities in those areas?
Excuse me, which areas?
In the new area of the NHD line that takes the left-hand turn?
I still don't understand. What do you mean, the new area?
Okay. The NHD line deviates from the blue line from 1905, and it goes over to the E and Squirrel Inn. Is that correct?
Yes.
And why did the NHD line make a change?
I didn't make it, so I don't know the answer to that.
So there could be changes that are all naturally occurring without any impact by man. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, could you specify what type of changes?
A change in location of the NHD line.
Could you repeat the question?
Are all changes to the NHD line a result of the influence of man?
No, not all changes to NHD line.
Thank you. Does the NHD data set accurately depict the current location of a stream in this location?
That is how it's mapped.
My question was, does it accurately depict a location of a stream in this location, if you're aware of?
I would say yes, there is probably an ephemeral stream in that location.
Okay. Does compilation of the NHD dataset include verification of these types of features?
Ms. Stork?
There is a process for submitting changes if you know that the features are incorrect.
Okay. And when was that that process developed?
I don't know, but I can say that shape files haven't been around forever, so it's more recent.
Okay. Is it fair to say that PT 314 was intended to show the hydrologic differences between SOS 91, which was published in 1905, and current topo maps for Strawberry Canyon?
Between SOS 91 and the current NHD, yes.
Yes. Okay, thanks.
Well, can I add something that it was also to help clarify, because this SOS 91 is a very, very large map, and this is a zoomed in portion, that the relevant portion.
Okay.
I agree.
Does the canyon to the west of Strawberry Canyon have any water extraction points of diversion that you're aware of?
You mean now or in 1905 or when?
At any point in time.
Yes.
Do they still exist today?
I don't know.
So you're not aware of any that currently exist?
No.
Okay. Does the canyon to the east of Strawberry Canyon have any water extraction points of diversion?
I don't believe so. But it depends on what you mean by canyon and how far you're going down. I assume you mean on the scale that we're looking at this. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm talking about maybe one or two sections over that would include maybe the
Objection, please.
I'm merely clarifying the question that was asked to me by the witness.
Yeah, Ms. Fry, the objection's overruled. Mr. Sanders, I think, is trying to clarify his question and perhaps then follow up with another question. So he's not testifying. But Mr. Sanders, why don't you try to start over with your clarified question, please?
Okay. Does the canyon to the east of Strawberry Canyon, which probably includes City Creek, does it have any water extraction points of diversion?
Objection.
Objection's overruled. Mr. Eggers or Mr. Stewart, you may answer.
What do you mean by canyon? I mean, canyon can be a very large feature, or you could be talking about something the size of what we're looking at on PT 314.
Well, we define Strawberry Canyon. Let's define the canyon to be from the headwaters down to Santa Ana River.
From the headwaters of what?
The headwaters of the canyon to the east, which I believe includes City Creek.
Objection, Your Honor. From the headwaters to the Santa Ana would include everything in the San Bernardino Mountains.
So I'm going to sustain the objection. Mr. Sanders, I'm not going to tell you how to ask your questions, but I think it might be good if you just want to ask Mr. Eggers if he knows if there are or historically were any diversions from City Creek. Is that what you want to ask him?
Sure. Mr. Eggers, were there any diversions from City Creek that you're aware of?
I'm fairly sure that there are diversions from City Creek, but I'm not aware of any specific diversions from City Creek.
Okay. Ms. Stork, are you aware of any?
I would have to review a bunch of historical information that I don't have, so I can't say either way. I'm not aware of any.
You're not aware of any. Okay, thank you.
A little bit of nuance. There probably was at some point, but I have no information.
Okay. Thank you. Are you aware of hydrologic differences between SOS 91 and the NHD data for canyons to the east or west of Strawberry Canyon?
I'll object to the extent this
Object.
goes outside the scope of the witness's testimony. I mean, this map was presented for a very specific purpose, very narrowly, and these questions go beyond that.
And I'm going to overrule that objection. I think it is, I mean, if the witnesses know, if they don't know, they can say so, but if they know, I think it does bear directly on the accuracy of basically the 1905 map hydrologic depictions versus the NHD data set. I understand that's what Mr. Sanders is getting at. I think that's a perfectly appropriate line of questioning. So, Mr. Eggers or Ms. Stork, do you know, and if you need to, we can have Mr. Sanders repeat the question.
Please repeat the question.
Are you aware of hydrologic differences between SOS 91 and NHD data for canyons to the east or west of Strawberry Canyon?
Well, I think you can see in this, even this map right here, there is a difference just above the legend. There is a red line that doesn't follow a blue line.
Can I add a little bit of context?
Please.
Okay. Yeah. So there are going to be some differences between the NHD and the map as produced in 1905. I think I'll just leave it at that. You can ask more questions about that. I don't want to go beyond too far what you're asking.
Did you review the 1905 map for changes in canyons to the east or west, like you did for your review of the Strawberry Creek Canyon?
I can say that I didn't, because the red line follows an existing topographic contour and the blue line follows an existing topographic contour. And so I was just, when working with Tomas, we were just focused on this area. Plus we were responding narrowly.
So your testimony is you did not review how NHD data are currently reflected in adjacent canyons. Is that correct?
Not specifically. Again, I can say that, you know, if you look broadly throughout California, how things are mapped in 1905 versus the NHD, there are going to be some differences.
You are using the change that you note between the NHD data and the 1905 map, you're using as an inference, correct?
In this exhibit, there is some inference. The main focus is that the stream going past 1 and 3 was mapped. Is intermittent, and it's no longer mapped at all.
So wouldn't you want to know how similar current streams are mapped in adjacent canyons?
Objection. This is beyond the scope.
Objection is overruled. As I said before, in response to an objection from Mr. Petrozelli, I think this does go to the accuracy of these two data sets. And I think the line of questioning is appropriate. So go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Ms. Stark.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's relevant, because we know that someone actually mapped this in 1905 and saw the intermittent stream. That's why it's mapped there. And we know that there's no longer a stream mapped there. it is mapped in a different location. That's probably because of the digital elevation model. They probably looked for like, this is me guessing entirely, so maybe I'll stop there. I assume that the red line is based on the DEM, as well as the historical stream information. I don't know the exact process, but the biggest thing is that it was there and now it's not.
You just said that we know somebody went out there and mapped that particular stream. Is that correct?
Prior to 1905 for the 1905 map.
And you know that based on what information?
Because there were no aerial flights or satellite mapping techniques.
And did they map water courses and verify that water existed in those gullies and ravines at the time that this map was prepared?
That was the standard practice.
But we don't have any information to verify that. Is that correct?
Based on what I said earlier, I can speak to the standard practices, but I can't speak to exactly how they did it for this map.
Okay. The yellow dots on PT 314 identify other points of diversion. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And just under the S in strawberry, at the top of the map are 2 yellow dots. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is the lower of those 2 yellow dots the U.S. Forest Service point of diversion?
I can answer that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the lower of the 2 dots right below the S, the U.S. Forest Service diversion, is the lower dot.
Okay, thank you. And what is the upper yellow dot?
That is the location as provided by BTB's predecessor of one of the respondents' diversions. The location was incorrectly provided on the original material.
I'm sorry, the upper yellow dot was a point of diversion that was identified by BTB, is that correct?
By their predecessor on a groundwater recordation. Yeah, on a groundwater recordation.
So this is a groundwater recordation. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And did you analyze the effects to the hydrology of Strawberry Canyon from the pumping of that groundwater well?
There's no well there. That was incorrectly, that I believe the record for that, the groundwater recordation ID actually matches to one of the Spring 7 diversions. And again, that was the location as provided on a groundwater recordation by BTB's predecessor. And when it was loaded into our ERIM system, staff took the location from the form and plotted it based on the location in the form, and the location in the form was not correct.
Okay. Did you analyze
that is what this hearing is about, the effect of that groundwater recordation.
Wait, Mr. Eggers, I don't think that's responsive to his question. I'm going to strike that. Mr. Sanders, why don't you go ahead with your next question?
Did you analyze the effects to the hydrology of Strawberry Canyon from the pumping of any groundwater wells?
Any groundwater wells?
Yes, that were not operated by BTB.
I can't say no. Didn't you look at one? Sorry.
Yeah. Not for this part of the testimony, but BTB has provided written testimony, proposed written testimony, rebuttal testimony, and I have looked at some of their exhibits and claims,
I'm
but they have
asking,
not provided that testimony yet. So I'm not sure how to answer, since we're in a sort of a phase right now where you have proposed testimony out there that I've looked at.
has the prosecution team done any analysis of impacts from groundwater wells to the hydrology of Strawberry Canyon?
And as I said, I have looked at BTB's proposed exhibits and testimony, and I have analyzed some of what's in there.
Okay.
But that testimony has not been provided yet.
Did the 2017 ROI acknowledge that groundwater wells near Rim Forest, immediately up gradient of Spring 7 complex, may extract groundwater that could contribute to springs in the Strawberry Creek watershed?
Would you like me to go back and review the 2017 RI to see if it says those exact words?
Sure. Let's bring up PT 13, page 26, please.
Okay, we'll go to PT 13, page 26. And while we're getting that, Mr. Sanders, how much more time do you want for cross-examination? You've been going almost an hour here.
I'd also object to the use of the 2017 ROI for this questioning, since it's not the operative investigatory document for the proposed cease and desist order. The 2021 ROI might be more appropriate.
I'm going to overrule that objection. I think it's appropriate for Mr. Sanders to use a document like this prepared by the prosecution team while cross-examining prosecution team witnesses. So I'm going to allow the question, which he hasn't asked yet, but I assume he's going to ask a question about this page. But before we do that, Mr. Sanders, can you just give me a time estimate here? I've been giving you some leeway, but we're going on an hour on basically about 7 or 8 pages of written testimony here. So how much more time do you think you're going to need?
I don't anticipate many more questions, probably maybe 10 minutes at most.
Okay, why don't you proceed and we'll see where we are in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. So I did ask a question.
Okay, first of all, tell us where you want us to scroll to on this page and then repeat your question so it's clear.
Toward the bottom of this page, and since these are not lined, so the very last sentence, Mr. Eggers, can you just please read that last sentence that goes on to the next page as well?
Additionally, well completion reports for wells installed in rim forest immediately up gradient of the Spring 7 complex and within the Strawberry Creek watershed are available on the GeoTracker regulatory site, State Water Board 2015, which contains...
I think we better go to the next page so we can finish the sentence.
Well completion reports from DWR.
And then please read the next sentence.
These wells in rim forest may extract groundwater that could contribute to springs in the Strawberry Creek watershed.
Okay. So did the ROI acknowledge that groundwater wells near rim forest may extract groundwater that could contribute to springs in the Strawberry Creek watershed?
Can I answer that? Yes, it does say that.
Thank you. Are there other groundwater wells in the area?
I was basing this information, sorry, the answer is I don't know. And if I can provide some context, I was basing this information on a data set that comes from the Department of Water Resources well completion reports. Drillers have been required to submit these since about 1947, but in many cases, reports aren't submitted. So when there is a well completion report that's accurately mapped in their system, then that is affirmative. Yes, we know there's a well there, but if there's nothing mapped, we don't necessarily know that there aren't wells.
Okay.
And I did recently look at the wells in the area, particularly ones that were proposed as perhaps influencing the groundwater and the flow of springs in Strawberry Canyon, and did not find any that appear to be able to influence the flow of the springs in Strawberry Canyon.
What wells did you review?
The wells in table 3 of the proposed testimony of, well, BTB 7 that hasn't been introduced.
So you did no analysis prior to this, prior to the proposed testimony of BTB. Is that correct?
I can say that when I did this report in 2017, I didn't do an analysis based on pumping data because pumping data aren't available. Well completion reports tell you that there's a well there and possibly how much water it could produce, but pumping data for individual wells isn't something that's necessarily measured or publicly available.
Okay.
Furthermore, about at least 5 of the 7 wells that are listed on table 3 have been destroyed.
Mr. Eggers?
No, let him, you asked the question. I think
I did not.
Okay, well, I'm going to allow him to finish his answer to that. Please go ahead, Mr. Eggers.
Yeah, the wells that were noted on table 3 have mostly been destroyed, and the well completion reports, half of them are also well destruction reports.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Sanders.
Ms. Stork, you testified that you were rebutting the testimony of Mr. Larry Lawrence. Is that correct?
Yes.
Ms. Stork?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I said yes. Did that not get picked up by my mic?
I didn't pick it up. My apologies. Okay. Did Mr. Lawrence mention developed water in the testimony that you are rebutting?
Could we go to my testimony?
Sure.
Okay, let's put up PT 313.
And I believe it's on page 3, lines 5 through 7.
All right, so is that where you want us to be? Well, this is PT 312. I think we want, I think we want PT 313 as Ms. Stork's testimony. All right, and go to page 3. There we go. Now tell us where you want us to scroll to, Mr. Sanders.
In paragraph 5 is I think what Ms. Stork was needing.
Okay, so scroll, Ms. Mullen, please scroll down to about line 19. All right, we have paragraph 5. Now go ahead and ask your question.
Did Mr. Lawrence mention developed water in the testimony that you are rebutting?
Not in this quote.
Okay. Yeah, you prepared a new analysis of the quantity of developed water. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in your testimony, you rely on SOS 012. Is that correct?
Yes.
Please bring up SOS 012.
Okay, we'll get SOS 012. I think we haven't pulled that up before, so it'll take us just a moment. All right, so why don't you, Ms. Mullen, just zoom out a little bit, and then Mr. Sanders, tell us what page you want us to look for.
Well, let's just start right there, please. What is SOS 012?
The Arrowhead Springs by John F. Mann Jr., published on April 1st, 1988, or produced.
And what was the source of this document?
I don't know. This is Story of Stuff's exhibit.
Okay. Did anybody testify to the authenticity of this document?
I don't know.
Do you know what it was prepared for?
Based on context in the report, it seems like it's a report prepared by a geologist for BTP's predecessor.
Do you know that for sure?
I would have to reread the report or see if anyone in Story of Stuff said that.
Do you know why it was prepared?
I don't know why precisely.
The title of this document refers to Arrowhead Springs, plural. Is that correct?
Yes.
How many springs were mentioned in this document?
I would have to look through it again.
Does this document only mention Spring 7?
I can't recall.
Do you know where the remainder of this document is?
No.
Okay. Is it the practice of the prosecution team to use documents whose source or veracity cannot be verified?
I can't answer that. I'm not an attorney. I saw this exhibit come in from Story of Stuff.
In your analysis that you prepared for this testimony, you used only the August flows identified by Mann in SOS 12 to make your assessment. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the August flows you identified in each year in table PT 315 were based on how many samples to achieve those numbers?
What do you mean samples?
Let's bring up PT 315.
Okay, we'll get PT 315.
And Mr. Lilly, as a time check, you said you would allow, Mr. Sanders said he needed about 10 more minutes, about 10 minutes ago.
All right, I note that. Mr. Sanders said about 10 minutes. I'm going to give him a little leeway here. I assume
almost done, Mr. Lilly.
Go ahead.
So you have columns entitled Spring Tunnel 7 and boreholes 7A plus 7B. And for instance, in August of 1946, you have Spring Tunnel 7 and you have a number that's 51,000 gallons per day. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. how many samples was used to establish that number of 51,000?
You don't use a sample.
How many,
I think you mean something different.
How many numbers were collected?
I don't know, but I can talk about the process for measuring flow, as can Tomas.
Did SOS 12 describe that process?
I don't believe they did. I could see Tomas. I don't know if you've reviewed SOS 12, if you recall whether or not they described the process for measuring the flow. They may have, I can't recall.
Could we look at that? It does get into some of it, and there may be something in there. I do recall something about how and when they measured. They described that, but I can't recall off the top of my head. Are you looking more of like what equipment they used, or how often they went out, or what exactly?
I'm asking. My question is, was this a one-time assessment?
Well, clearly not. They've got August 1946, August 1947, August 1948.
Was this sample taken on one day? Was it one measure in time? Or were there multiple?
It couldn't be. There's different years there. It couldn't all have happened. You can't collect multiple years data on one day. So I would say no.
That's not what I asked.
I can answer.
Ahead,
so
Clark,
for
please.
example, for the August 1946 measurement, they give an instantaneous flow rate. An instantaneous flow rate is usually measured like you would, for example, set up a weir, and you look at the height of the flow through the V-notch, and that you use some calculations for your wear plate, and that tells you the rate of flow.
Okay, so all of these numbers in this table were instantaneous flow rates?
To the best of my understanding, yes, especially because of their description of the flow, yeah.
And they were a one-time measurement for each of those months, is that correct?
That is what I gathered from the report. So to the best of my knowledge. Sometimes it's standard practice to, like, when I measure flow, I usually do 3 measurements and then write them down and maybe take the average. That's something I would spell out in my methods. It's hard to know because this was 1946, but yeah, it appears to be an instantaneous flow measurement.
Okay.
Yeah, it would be a standard practice to do multiple measurements and average them. That's what Roe did.
Is there any evidence in SOS 12 that demonstrates how these numbers were collected?
I think Mr. Eggers was saying, like, he read some information in the report.
Can you point
on how?
Can you point me to the?
I've seemed to recall that, but I don't recall exactly where it is. I would have to review it again.
So, Mr. Sanders, let us know if you want us to put SOS 12 on the screen and scroll through that. It's up to you.
If Mr. Eggers can demonstrate that it's in there, please do, but I don't believe that it's included in SOS 12.
Well, okay, so in the interest of moving forward, I mean, this is probably an argument you can make.
Mr. Eggers, I'll make just a question. Are you currently aware of any information that would demonstrate that this is other than an instantaneous measurement?
I feel like I would have to review it again.
That didn't answer my question. I feel like
I recall something, but I don't recall exactly. So I would need to review it again to answer the question.
Are you currently aware of any information that this was other than an instantaneous measurement?
Objection asked and answered.
Can we limit which attorneys are participating on behalf of the prosecution team, please?
Wait, okay. First of all, Ms. Doty is attorney for story of stuff, not prosecution team, so she's allowed to state objections. But I'm going to overrule the objection. I think Mr. Sanders is still trying to get a specific answer that he has not gotten. So I'm going to, Mr. Sanders, why don't you try again? If Mr. Eggers basically says again that he can't recall, then I'm going to say, let's take a 5-minute break and let him read SOS 12 if you want that to happen so we can get a complete answer from him. So it's your decision. You're asking the questions.
We'll take a 5-minute break and see whether he can find that information in SOS 12.
Okay, as I recall, it's not that many pages long, so I think 5 minutes should be sufficient. So again, everybody don't log off. It's 11:26. Let's come back at 11:31 and we'll go from there. Thank you. right, we'll just let everybody get back and we'll get going again. There's Mr. Petrozelli. We just need Ms. Stork. There's Ms. Stork, and we need Mr. Eggers. All right, so Ms. Stork and Mr. Eggers, during the break, did you each have a chance to read SOS 12, Exhibit SOS 12?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so Mr. Sanders, you may proceed.
Thank you. In the flows that were reported on PT 315, were they based on a single instantaneous sample?
Again, it's not a sample.
Yeah,
It's a measurement.
Were they based on a single instantaneous measurement?
It's not really clear, I would say.
I would agree with that.
Was there any information to suggest that it was multiple measurements?
Any
No.
information in the exhibit or any
In the
information
exhibit.
in the work of?
In the exhibit.
Well, there are many specific dates in the way it's referred to when you describe sort of a narrative of how the flows changed over time. It appears that they were measuring quite frequently, but there's no indication of the specific numbers, particularly the ones that end with all zeros. For example, 84,000. There's a table that has more specific figures than that, and so the sort of larger rounded off numbers don't have any particular description of how they were arrived at.
Okay. Is it your testimony that the flow from Spring Tunnel 7 is approximately the same as the flow from boreholes 7A and 7B? And this is directed to Ms. Stork.
Can we go to my testimony?
Sure. PT 313 at page 5.
Okay, we'll put up PT 313, go to page 5. All right, go ahead, Mr. Sanders. What's your question?
Is it your testimony that the flow from Spring Tunnel 7 is approximately the same as the flow from boreholes 7A and 7B?
Can we go to where it says that in my testimony?
Well, let me ask you, is it your opinion that the flow from Spring Tunnel 7 is approximately the same as the flow from boreholes 7A and 7B?
And Mr. Sanders, excuse me, I think you need to clarify as to the time frame. It's actually back on the prior page, because Ms. Stork's written testimony does talk about two different time frames. So when you just say the flow from, it's not clear. And so if you could maybe rephrase the question to make it clear as to the time frames for the two flows you're talking about.
Okay. The time frame that you used for developing PT 315. Is it your opinion that the flow from Spring Tunnel 7 is approximately the same as the flow from boreholes 7A and 7B?
Based on the information.
And again, Mr. Sanders, it still suffers, your question still suffers the same defect, because she talks about the flows from Spring Tunnel 7 during 1946 to 1949, and then the flows from borehole 7A and 7B from 1953 to 1957. I assume you're talking about comparing those flows from the different sources during those different years. Is that what you're getting at here?
I am, Mr. Lilly, because that's the premise of her testimony. So yes.
Okay, so why don't you restate your question so it's clear as to the years you're talking about for the flows from each of these two sources?
Okay. let's bring up PT 315.
Okay, we'll put up PT 315 and make it a little bit bigger. Okay, thank you.
So is it your testimony that the flow from Spring Tunnel 7 from August of 1946 to August of 1949 is approximately the same as the flow from boreholes 7A and 7B from August 1953 to 1957?
Based on the information and Story of Stuff Exhibit 12, I would say yes.
Was this the same conclusion reached by Mr. Mann?
I don't recall. I know I just read that, but I was reading it for methods, not for any final conclusions.
Okay, can we bring up SOS 12, page 3? And while we're waiting for that to come up, I want to clarify for the record that BTB does not accept the veracity of SOS 12 or its source.
Objection, these are in evidence, so the foundation has already been laid. They've been admitted to evidence.
All right, so Mr. Sanders, we're spending a lot of time on this. I mean, this is important, and I have given you some leeway to ask questions about this, but at some point, I think you can make these points in your arguments in closing brief as effectively or more effectively than asking these witnesses questions. I mean, you can quote.
I have Mr. Lilly, I have 2 or 3 more questions. Part of the delay has been from the prosecution team not being familiar with the records that they're testifying from. And so I apologize for that, but I shouldn't be penalized for that.
And I'm not penalizing you for that. Why don't you just continue with your 2 or 3 more questions and we'll see where we are.
Sure. So Ms. Dork, please read the last 3 sentences of the paragraph, of the second paragraph. So let's
okay, so
see.
We'll scroll down here so it's on the screen.
The start flow of the old tunnel.
Wait, scroll down a little more, Miss Mullen. Okay, wait, that's good.
Right
so do you
there.
want, where do you want to start?
So the sentence that begins with the combined, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 9 lines up from the bottom.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The combined flow of numbers 7A and 7B, 45,000 gallons per day, appeared to be a considerable gain over the 26,000 gallons per day that the tunnel had been flowing prior to the drilling of 7A and 7B. By the end of
Miss Stark,
Yep.
Slow down. We have a court reporter.
Oh, sorry. Would you like me to start over?
No, just go about half as fast.
By the end of 1950, the 2 new holes were flowing 27,600 GPD, that's gallons per day, which is probably several thousand more GPD than would have flowed from the tunnel had it been left undisturbed. In addition to the water drained from the tunnel, it appears that 7A and 7B also tapped water from fractures that had not been reached by the shorter tunnel.
Based on this statement, was the conclusion you reached the same as Mr. Mann?
No, I had a different interpretation of the data.
Okay.
And if you read one sentence prior to where you started, it makes clear.
Thank you.
That wasn't that wasn't Mr. Mann's full conclusion.
Is it your testimony that you did not prepare a comparison of tunnels 7C and 7D because it may have resulted in non-representative flow measurements?
Yes, I believe so. I would want to double check my testimony.
Sure. It's PT 313, page 4.
All right, let's put up PT3, try that one again. PT313, page 4.
Lines 9 through 10.
Yes, that is my testimony. Non-representative flow due to shut-ins.
Wouldn't it be better to perform the analysis instead of predetermining the outcome?
I'm sorry?
Wouldn't it be better to perform an assessment of the impacts, an assessment of the data, than to predetermine the outcome and not do an assessment?
I'm confused about the question because I was quite intrigued when I tabulated the data and the table landed on the identical numbers. I was shocked that I was that lucky with data analysis that the numbers came up the same. So I did not predetermine the outcome of the analysis. I went through systematically through SOS 12.
For 7C and 7D?
I'm sorry. For 7C and 7D, there were so many shut-ins that you couldn't get an accurate flow measurement, in my opinion. There wasn't enough information. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah, I think something's wrong with your mic, Mr. Sanders.
Uh-oh.
I'm sorry.
You're back. Good. Go
Okay,
ahead.
sorry. You said you did not prepare a comparison of tunnel 7C and 7D because it may have resulted in non-representative flow measurements. Is that correct?
Correct.
So wouldn't it be better to perform an analysis to determine whether there's a comparison that can be done than to make a decision that it was not going to be representative before you did an analysis?
No, the way I did it is the more robust way to deal with data. That is like standard practice. You always ask the question first, because if you look at too much data, you can sometimes get an anomalous result. I mean, I could go into like p-values and statistical probabilities, but no. The scientifically accepted way is to ask a question of your data.
Okay, so you did prepare a comparison of the data. Is that correct?
I prepared a comparison of the data with tunnel 7, comparing that to borehole 7A and 7B.
So I'm confused because you just said you did not prepare a comparison.
Objection.
No.
Misstates the testimony of the witness. Ms. Stork, I believe Ms. Stork previously testified that there were too many shut-ins for 7C and 7D to perform an accurate analysis.
Yeah, the objection is sustained, Mr. Sanders. I think you've misstated her prior testimony, maybe confusing the 7A, 7B data with the 7C, 7D data. So go ahead and ask your next question.
Not confused.
Okay, well, it was confusing to me, I'll just say. So go ahead.
Is it your testimony that you did not prepare a comparison of tunnels 7C and 7D because it may have resulted in non-representative flow measurements?
Due to shut-ins, yes.
So you did not do the comparison, is that correct?
Correct.
So my question is, wouldn't it be better to perform the analysis?
No.
Asked and answered, she already said that she didn't do the analysis because there were too many shut-ins for accuracy.
I think, Mr. Sanders, she has explained why she didn't do the analysis. So if you have another question, go ahead, but I think she has answered that one.
Okay. I have no further questions, Mr. Lilly.
All right, thank you, Mr. Sanders.
Can I have both witnesses preserve any notes they used for today's testimony?
I have no notes.
Okay, yeah, it's just, they're both saying no notes. It's only notes that you reviewed during your testimony, and that's, but if you don't have any, we don't need to get into that. This is an artifact of when we used to all be in one room, and it was appropriate for attorneys to see the notes that witnesses looked at during their testimony. But if you don't have any, we don't need to go on. All right. So we're getting close to our noon break time. By just a show of hands, who else, if anyone, wants to ask Mr. Eggers or Ms. Stork any questions on cross-examination? Okay, I see Mr. Lowe. I do not see anybody else. All right, Mr. Lowe, please proceed with your questions. Go off mute before you do. There you go. And take your hand down, electronic hand down. All right, go ahead.
Okay, Ms. Stork. I understand why you wanted to address the USGS map and the historical use, because BlueTriton also did that in their testimony. However,
wait, Mr. Lowe, please get to a question here, not a statement.
Okay. Do you really believe that someone walked every blue line stream on those USGS maps during the fall, early fall, late summer, to see if there was water in those streams?
No, that's not what I said before. May I expand?
Sure. I mean,
okay.
Go ahead and clarify, please.
So someone would have had to survey all of that ground to draw the topographic lines and to draw the streams as they are depicted on the map. It would have taken years to do that. So it wouldn't have been during a single season. It's possible they may have covered that area in a single season, but they also may have done found some lines that don't go together right and needed to go back and correct that. So it's hard to say the time period, but it would have taken considerable time to complete that map.
Okay, and wouldn't you agree that most of that work was done from high elevation points where they could see the country and see the lay of the land and survey from there rather than walking in the bottoms of the drainages?
I haven't done surveying. Tomas, are you familiar with the practice? I would assume that you would work from bottom to top.
They would have likely been all over that area. I couldn't say what time of the year, though. That's certainly not on the map.
I think you have to get in the drainages to really map them. But I'm not a surveyor. I'm not a licensed engineer. I'm a licensed geologist, so that's not part of my training.
Okay, thank you. In 1905, I'm sorry, excuse me, let me think here. Okay. Those are estimates based on what we know and you know. So wouldn't it be better to use actual on the ground measurements of water that were made historically than those maps that are USGS maps?
It depends what the purpose is and what the question we're asking is.
Okay. Would you agree that the row mapping and the row data that was collected on flows during the dry periods of 1929 and 1930 are the very best indicator we have of what was perennial flows at that time?
I think Tomas is the best one to answer these questions because he went through the row notes extensively and I did not.
Yeah, I would agree that the row notes are a much better indication of the perennial nature of that stream than the 1905 map, if that's as I understand your question.
And Mr. Eggers, that was fine, I heard you, but please talk a little louder for your next answer. Go ahead, Mr. Lowe.
That's all I have, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Lowe. I think that was all. Does anybody else have any cross-ex questions for Ms. Stork or Mr. Eggers? And Mr. Petrus, I do not have any questions for these two witnesses. Mr. Petrozelli, do you have any redirect questions?
May I confer with my team for a moment?
Please just take a moment. We'll just stay here on the record. I'd like to wrap this up before noon if we can.
No further questions, Mr. Lilly.
All right, thank you. Then we will check my notes here. Mr. Petrozelli, would you like to offer these prosecution team rebuttal exhibits into evidence?
You're muted.
Thank you, Mr. Eggers. Mr. Lilly, I would like to offer these prosecution team exhibits into evidence. I will note that I forgot to put an exhibit number on, I think, PT 314, and I can correct that if you like.
All right, I think it is stated in the in your table of exhibits, but yes, if you can submit a revised version, and the only change I take it will be you'll put an exhibit number in the upper right-hand corner.
Yes.
All right, so with that, do you want to offer into evidence it's PT 312 through PT 315, is that correct?
I believe so.
Okay, well, that's what I have. So does anyone have any objections to these exhibits being entered into evidence?
For clarity of the record, I believe Ms. Stork orally corrected her written testimony. Is the prosecution team resubmitting a corrected document that reflects that oral correction?
Actually, thank you, Ms. Grady. I would rather they don't. I think it's better on the record to have, since it's just a one-word change, I think it's better to have the version with the old where it said perennial. This is on exhibit PT 313, page 3, line 8. And I crossed it out on mine and wrote intermittent and made a note changed by Ms. Stork during hearing testimony. So I think other people can do that too. And that way the record will be clear as to the change. But I don't think we're going to mark it on the exhibit that, well, actually, I take it back. Mr. Petrozelli, how would you like to handle that? It would be good to have it corrected in the record. Maybe I should just follow Ms. Grady's suggestion and have you submit a revised version of PT.
I can submit a revised version of that and note that the only change to Ms. Stork's testimony has been to that one word per.
All right, so why don't you
oral testimony?
Why don't you submit PT 313 revised? You'll just have that one word change and just note that in your transmittal. That I thank you, Ms. Grady. That will be better to do that way. And then PT 314 just with the exhibit number. So with that, are there any objections to any of these 4 exhibits coming into evidence? All right, hearing none, those exhibits will be admitted into evidence. And we will next come to Mr. Lowe. And I think the best thing, Mr. Lowe, I don't know what happened. We can see your roof, but we can't see you. There you are, you're back. Since we're getting very close to the noon break here, I'll just tell you this, and you can be thinking about this during the lunch break. I have carefully read your exhibit, which we marked as exhibit Low 2, and I will ask you to confirm that that's your rebuttal testimony. It's not really necessary for you to summarize it. I mean, it's very clear, and I certainly read it. But since I've allowed other parties opportunities to briefly summarize the key points in their testimony, I will allow you to do that if you want to. But I suggest, if you have not already done so, that during our break, you just go through and say, here are the 5 points I want to make and summarize in this exhibit, rather than some written narrative. I think that'll be more efficient, and we'll get through that. And then, of course, I'll allow other parties to ask cross-examination questions, and we'll go from there. And then just for our plan, after we complete Mr. Lowe's testimony, we will move to BlueTriton's rebuttal testimony and exhibits, which is just one witness, Mr. Nichols, and several exhibits. So we will go through those after we're done with Mr. Lowe. So with that, it's just before noon. I think I think we can restart at 1 o'clock. So let's plan to take an hour and 3 minutes for our break, and we'll all come back at 1 o'clock. And just a reminder, the way our broadcasts work, we have to do a separate broadcast for the afternoon. So at the lunch break, you should log off, and then a few minutes before 1 o'clock, you can log back on using the same Zoom ID, but you'll be logging into basically a different recording. So with that, and unless there's anything else, we will take our noon break, and I will see everybody at 1 o'clock. Thank you.